You know what? There are a few games that are as recognizable when it comes to characters as Gears of War. Everyone remembers the first time you played as Dom or Marcus, two characters who are bathed in enough Decadiana ball that their junk probably looks like a semi-truck trailer dragging two tiny depressed sacks of potatoes behind it. Guys that were so badass they wore body armor made of cars but protected their friggin' heads with beanies. It's always been go big or go home for the third-person shooter Gears franchise, and few games today explicitly target that same with such razor-sharp focus. So how do you one-up Gears of War 4, when by this point the characters might as well just shoot themselves out of cannons as the projectile? That's right, you go big in the one place that prior Gears games have not done, by strapping on a more in-depth story, a new protagonist or two, and then attaching wide open spaces and exploration to the already tried and true chess match with chainsaws of the previous titles. But how much gas really is left in this tank? Well, that's a question a lot of us have had, and today I'm going to try to answer that. I'm Karak with ACG, and as always, it's my continuing mission to bring you reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap. As always, if you like the video, maybe subscribe. So here's my review for Gears 5, Diesel Fuel Johnny 5, Horizon Zero Dawn, and easily the worst game world to ever be a helicopter pilot in. Graphics are up first. I think it's actually pretty hard to remember any Gears game that wasn't really good looking day and date, and luckily Gears 5 follows right along that path, whether you're on the Xbox original, the S, the X, or the PC, and I've always loved the original developers and now Coalition's desire to see just how far across the color gamut they can push your eyes before something in your brain goes friggin' haywire. Gears 5 is always doing that. It's always throwing something at you with rooms and locations filled with volumetric fog, tons of particle effects, or just some weird alien thingamajig that looks like it diphthongs your whatchamacallit. You may not know what you're looking at, but Gears 5 makes sure you know it's something cool. Also, they continue to excel with their character design and level of detail, and while not as detailed when it comes to skin work as, say, the Resident Evil 2 remaster we saw recently, or even God of War, or something along those lines, there's rarely a character you need to see more than once before you know exactly who they are and what they do. This attention to detail continues with the many locations that the game throws at you throughout the 12-plus hour campaign. And speaking of locations, who doesn't like to put on their best vacation clothes and then tear ass through random alien locales and blast giant craters in them as fast as possible? Interestingly enough, this is the change-up, and we see that with Gears 5 throughout, at times abandoning the tighter, coffin-like confines of much of the past titles and opening up the game world a bit during particular chapters as you explore. Even if that exploration is really something akin to going camping by outfitting your trailer with a generator, a full-spec PC, and then parking near a tree and calling it a forest, but I'll get to that in the gameplay section. Gear transitions from closed environments and dank subterranean, not really alien layers, to open snow-filled valleys to firestorm-covered deserts without hesitation, and does it fairly fluidly. But even in the open locations, it looks and continues to exude that Gears of War feel, that almost utilitarian chic, post-apocalyptic look to the world. From helicopters to guns to motorcycles to the skiff you haphazardly sail around in the more open areas, the game never tries to look like something else, even when it's doing something else. And lastly, when it comes to the enemy design, I continue to like the Gears enemies, and I really do like them in Gears 5. There's a couple additional new things going on here, new gun designs, and all of them really do feel like they fit the theme throughout. I do have a couple complaints though, the first being that at times there are a number of low detail textures that pop up in areas, regardless of the location and the settings. The movement to these smaller, more cluttered spots in spaces can really make moving a hassle, and getting caught or backed up into a spot in the game world with nothing stopping you from man-rolling out of it by anything other than what looks like a small pebble on the ground can happen a lot. It's infuriating when you're in the midst of a boss battle or neck-deep in locusts, and instead of hopping over a broken barrier beside you, apparently your character suddenly becomes afraid of stubbing their toe and just rubs up against the geometry. Gears 4 seemed to have this more than the prior games, and I would say Gears 5 has it more than 4. Luckily, despite those issues, the game continues to be a looker. And when it comes to looks, let's talk about performance. And hats off to these guys. Aside from some bugs that I was warned about in the embargo information, Gears 5 runs spectacularly well. On the Xbox X, it's hitting almost locked 60 FPS, aside from one or two streaming frame drops at different times. The X is at 4K with a resolution that's dynamic, and it does reconstruction, and it offers HDR support as well. The original and the S models of the Xbox look to be about 1080p, also with a dynamic reconstruction. Now on an i7 at 4.7 with a 1080 Ti, 1080p with every setting on high, the game never drops below 60 and is far above that, and 1440p was doable, with a couple settings dropped of course here and there if you're having an issue with any kind of FPS. On a 2080 Ti, 4K 60 FPS was completely doable, with once again a couple drops here and there, especially on loading new areas. And most of the time, that frame rate is going to be much higher than that. Of course, setting down ambient occlusion settings and screen space reflections does help, so look at them for FPS improvements if you need it. Also, the game's automatic FPS scale within the game engine itself is perhaps the best one I have ever used. Without any noticeable drops of quality, the game kept at whatever FPS I chose in the listings and wanted while offering a clean look throughout. Additionally, there are a ton of settings. There's even settings subcategories for a lot of these. You know, the game really shows that you can add uniqueness to something so long encased in one particular presentation. And while not without its faults, the sheer anarchy and the moments of situational weather piping in across the front of your vehicle, the enemies exploding into giblets from some kind of horrifying turkey, really sets the tone. And speaking of tone, let's discuss sound, music, and voice.
Aren't going to protect you from an exploding rocket.
All right, then we call it. Let's go.
Hydraulic external power to on.
No! We get that hatch open.
What?
Kid, listen to your old man. You got to get out of there.
Damn it! Keep knocking him down!
And we're going to do sound first. Gears has never shied away from absolutely immersing you in the sounds of like 10 car crashes and a full-scale ground war all at the same time. Gears 5's no exception, with weapons both new and old offering a nice sonic footprint that allows for you to know exactly who's using what weapon on the battlefield at any one time, from the strange whirring sounds of grenades drilling into the ground to the sputtering and stuttering miniguns you tear out of enemies' hands. However, I did have a couple issues with some guns just sounding a little bit off. For example, the snub handgun. It's not just that it's a lighter weight gun, which would be fine. It's that its sound samples actually sounded like they were coming from maybe 5 or 10 feet in front of the character, regardless of the audio settings that I chose. This seemed to be replicated with both the console and the PC. Luckily, everything else here has the sonic kick that you're expecting and hoping for, and I really did dig it. And moving right along here, we're going to talk about music. Composing to Gears 5 is done by Ramin Djawadi, who also composed Gears 4. This is also the person who's done Game of Thrones, Westworld, and over 100 other TV shows and movies. And one of the things that you notice right away is just how oddly different, I feel at least, that Gears 5 sounds from 4. It's not that there isn't some epic moment or rhythmic battle tune that has you motor set to stir up your blood as you're bayoneting bad guys with the quickness, but there are far more sedate moments in Gears 5 than I think there were in 4, and I have to say it reminds me at times of Westworld's theme itself and its solo instruments than some other titles prior. The excellence here is in the building the tracks that at first seem unconnected to the others, before them and after them, only to surprise you when a tonal shift suddenly makes you go, oh man, that's actually awesome, those are connected. And it is without a doubt a soundtrack that I will listen to outside of the game, which is pretty rare for me. And that'll bring us to voice. Let's just cut to the chase here. I've always liked the Gears voice actors. It's hard to forget the first time you hear John DiMaggio's voice crackle across your speakers as Marcus, and you originally thought to yourself, so that's what a person sounds like if they have 2 Adam's apples and then told you to do their job after swallowing river rocks and gargling with gasoline. Lim McIntyre returns as JD Phoenix, Laura Bailey as Kate, and of course, who can forget the Coltrane himself, Lester Spate. The thing about Gears is this: for a game that seems so over the top and out of control from moment to moment, their voice work and choices continue to actually impress me. Also, the voice directing is really well done, especially here in Gears 5, which has a different tonal feel to it than the prior games. This is reflected in the voices themselves. There's also a couple small surprises in here, but overall I would say the voice acting is very, very good. And that brings us to gameplay and a bit about the story. So a lot about what drove Gears 4 story drives Gears 5, and that's for better or worse as you continue to discover more about the Locust and the Swarm. Here in 5, you take control of both JD Phoenix for a time as well as Kate Diaz, exploring a larger world than the past Gears games, and you dive deeper into the political strife behind the series, only to solve everything by shooting at it until it explodes into progressively smaller bits of meat, which I admit is probably why I like the Gears games in the past. It's what the Gears games have always excelled at, their almost exhaustive display of catastrophic action. Gears 5 is that at times. At other times, though, it's a bewildering mix of exploration and exposition that seems like it's going to leave a good number of gamers cold if they are not forewarned, so be prepared for that. After a couple minutes of story building, Gears starts out like all the other titles, an in-your-face Michael Bay-style beginning that has you clamoring quickly for weapons and battling back and forth through familiar territory, and this continues for a number of chapters and I feel sets a very strong tone. As always, the third-person gaming of Gears is one of the weightiest titles that there is. Guns try to leap up and climb out of your hand whenever you're firing more than a couple bullets at a time, and everyone continues to slide around the battlefield like the first military invention for the cogs were high-grade wheeled heel sneakers. And of course, the active reloading system continues here with a perfectly timed reloading, offering some kind of positive to each gun you use, as well as the relic versions of the guns that can be found in places across the world, adding these special bonuses to their normal variants. When it comes to control, I would say it's a bit more nuanced in Gears 5, but not overly so. It just does feel a little bit snappier. That might be that improved frame rate, especially on consoles. One of the larger changes to Gears 5, though, is that you're also teamed up with a hopped-up drone, Jack. Think of floating R2-D2 with an assortment of upgradable weapons on board. He starts out fairly mundane with the ability to heal the gears, interact with the game world, because frankly, half these dudes don't seem to be able to turn a computer on. But at the other times, you can collect resources and items around the game world, and then proceed to superglue them all over him until by the time you're done, he can revive team members, stealth your entire group, flashbang the enemies, and then erect a laser shield in front of you, as well as go out into the game world and pick up items and bring them back to you, which is a godsend, especially in the harder difficulties where sending Jack out to get a dropped gun can be the difference between you getting out alive or getting a Glasgow smile from an enemy's chainsaw. Jack can be controlled pretty easily with both the controller and keyboard, with you able to switch what skills he has, mostly on the fly. And just when you think you're getting it and you understand how to control Jack, the game opens up the levels for you, outfitting you with a vehicle to traverse the locations, finding crashed ships, scenes of old ambushes, and performing quests across a much larger space than the past game's levels were. It also has you outfitted with this abomination of machinery. It makes no sense. It's like a paraglider and a three-wheeler with a baby stroller attached to it for the other player. It's just odd. Now, what it lacks in looks and armament, it makes up for in... well, it actually doesn't make up for anything. It's just weird. You skim around the larger locations in it and then investigate these locations, branching off into smaller missions or larger missions depending. It's also impossible to feel like God of War, Halo, at least the original two, and some other titles didn't influence Gears 5. And we do know via interviews, at the very minimum, God of War did. But what those games do that Gears 5 doesn't is offer a tantalizing fear of enemies throughout those locations. Where Halo had amazing spots and open battles depending on which way you turned, God of War had hidden pockets of enemies, Gears 5 doesn't. It's got spots you go to and do things, and that's pretty much it. That does make it easier to travel to and from the locations you need, but it also removes a good deal of the mystery and the feeling of trajectory and always moving forward. And while it is true that you can get into some locations in a couple of ways or skirt around some enemies, it never feels as organic as those other titles. You can almost tell it's the first time they did this. This may also be because both of those were action games based on movement, where Gears 5 is more pop and stop kind of a title, so it would look odd to just be Kris Kringling across a winter wonderland and you find 5 giant slabs of ice all laid on their side just so you can have cover for a momentary battle. But honestly, I wish they would have figured out a way to do that, because it would have elevated this. Another thing I wasn't in love with is the story's pacing. While the voice acting was fine, the plot itself is pretty paper thin, even after the mystery that isn't a mystery as long as, you're breathing when you play the game, and that crops up its head. One cool twist did occur, but nothing else really made Gears 5 narratively particularly interesting to me. Lore bits you find around the game world do flesh out a good bit of what's going on as well, so keep your eye out, because when it comes to the action and the story, they're fairly separated. I can also say some people will probably love this feeling of exploration, possibly more than me, especially as we know this is our 5th title and a bit of a change-up is needed. When playing in co-op, the game allows for 3 players with one of you playing Jack. This can be odd despite Jack's abundance of items he can use and his elevated position in the battlefield. I like the idea, but I think a lot of fans would have loved an either-or situation. When playing Escape, it's 3-player as well co-op, and when playing Horde, you can do 5. As with all the Gears games, there are a number of these additional modes. Multiplayer mode is somewhat the same as Gears 4, though now each character has their own ultimate. Gears 5 has Deathmatch and Arms Race and Dodgeball, Escalation, Execution, Guardian, King of the Hill, Team Deathmatch, and Warzone currently as options. If you're a fan of Gears 4 multiplayer, I think you'll probably be a fan of Gears 5. There are changes throughout these, little bits for balance and so forth, and then there's an arcade mode that offers some flexibility to multiplayer that wasn't there before. I got some time with it, and I really liked what I got to play. Sadly, there were only a couple open times for true multiplayer during the review process, so I'll continue to cover it in the podcast on Friday, on Twitch, as well as any later videos I do. Horde mode also sees changes with characters all having a unique power, but also power taps, which, after defeating 10 waves, a place where you will want to move your defensive position appears to give you more power, meaning you won't be in the same spots over and over. This actually seems to be one of the largest changes, as some maps in the past Horde modes, I think we can all remember, there was sort of a spot you always sat in and you liked, and you didn't have to move around that much. Here, that will change. But the best part of the new multiplayer might actually be escape mode. This is where you and up to 2 friends plant a bomb inside an alien hive, and then you have to get out again. That all sounds fairly basic until you realize you can make your own maps for this. And while the game isn't replete with a ton of options here right now, you can still set up escape routes, place enemies down, and adjust it till your heart's content, then publish it for your friends or for you to play. While I wasn't in love with the way it constructed levels many times, I found that placing map tiles and putting enemies onto those tiles seemed a bit cumbersome. I love that Gears is embracing this, and while the maps can't be massive, you can thematically tie them together as well as have some basic rules for the missions. Again, they aren't huge maps, but the feeling of tension and creativity and the idea of making maps for friends or playing others sounds really cool, and I did like my time there. For most of the modes, you can also have bots fill out the ranks if you want to get your practice on. Of course, across all the multiplayer modes, you can customize your character. Sarah Connor from the Terminator series is currently in the game, and Batista was announced from the WWE coming at a later time. That does, of course, bring up one thing, which is microtransactions, so let's wrap this up. Now, they are in Gears 5, so if that bothers you, be warned. Currently, they are cosmetic only, but we saw how Gears 4 micros worked out, and that wasn't great for a lot of us. So I will update that as we move forward on this one. You buy iron, which is used to get cosmetics, and you get in the game anyway as well. And that allows you to buy different skins for guns and so forth. There are additional EXP boosters you can get for your character as well, but those aren't going to have you do any extra damage or anything like that. As a package, Gears 5 offers a steady series of improvements to the multiplayer, or at least it tries to. That'll be up in the air for a while. But when it comes to its single player, I think what it's aiming for will probably work for many people. It's just not necessarily the thing I love the most. There is still those sections that have long splitting linear levels that you can play out like chess matches with you and the various enemies changing directions and defenses until you don't even remember which direction you were trying to go, as well as more claustrophobic battle locations. But those open area ones, they just didn't feel as fleshed out as I would have liked. But if the game's fun, then maybe story doesn't matter, and that'll bring us to fun factor. Gears has always been a blast for me to play, and despite the issues I have with the story and the pacing, it continues to be that. Despite the issues with the open world areas, I got through them fairly quickly or ended up going to the mission locations and doing those and enjoyed all those battles. So when it comes down to it, there was still a lot of fun factor, but there's a bit of padding here that I necessarily don't enjoy. I wasn't a huge fan of the story either, as I've said before. So as you guys know, I rate games on a buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it again rating system, with rent being replaced by deep sale on PC. And, well, the nice thing is this thing's on Game Pass, so if you've got Game Pass, you can get it anyway. But we're talking about a retail purchase here. At a retail purchase, I would say this is worth getting despite my misgivings with the story and the open world areas, because some people are just going to experience it differently, and I can recognize something is good that I just don't necessarily love. There's a lot to like here. It's a very polished title, and those multiplayer and single-player changes are actually very cool, and that includes that multiplayer. I really did like the arcade modes I've got to play, and I absolutely loved Escape. That is going to be a very fun mode. And in the end, it is an incredibly polished title. So that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Check me out on Facebook and Reddit and Twitter. And you can always become a patron on the Patreon website, which helps me give you guys reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap. And it helps me continue to buy a copy of every single game I get, even if the developer gives me a code. And lastly, just a shout out to my next video at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here today, the day of this video going live. I'm going to be on Twitch, ACG on Twitch. We're going to be having a bunch of composers come on, as well as comic book writer Brian Edward Hill, and we're going to come together and discuss what it's like being a creator for music for video games, what it's like writing for Batman, and just sit down and talk about creating things. I would love for you guys, if you get a chance, to come by Twitch, ACG on Twitch, and watch that at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Peace out, and enjoy the rest of your week.